Her name was Maureen Sullivan. She was just 12 years old. For months, a man in her own home had been hurting her. Finally, she told her teacher, believing someone would help, believing adults would protect her. 24 hours later, Maureen stood in front of a grim gray stone building ringed by walls topped with broken glass. Nuns in black habits stripped her clothes, handed her a plain gray uniform, sat her in a chair, and cut her hair short. They told her she would never use her real name again. When Maureen asked when she could go home, no one answered. For the next 4 years, this 12-year-old girl scrubbed sheets 14 hours a day without a single penny. She was forbidden to speak. Whenever government inspectors came, the nuns hid her in an underground tunnel because a child working as a slave was impossible to explain. This is not a story from the Middle Ages. This happened in 1964. The last of these places finally closed in 1996. They were called the Magdalene Laundries. And what the Catholic Church in Ireland did to 30,000 women inside these walls remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Everything in this video is backed by survivor testimonies, government investigations, and official records. None of it is made up. If you want more stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me until the end, because what happened inside these walls was far worse than you think. To understand how a 12-year-old girl could be punished for being a victim, you first have to understand how Ireland worked back then. Ireland was not just a Catholic country. The Catholic Church ran Ireland completely. Priests did not simply give sermons on Sundays. They decided who got jobs and who did not. If the local priest liked you, doors opened. If he did not, you had no future. Bishops did not just run churches. They controlled what children learned in schools. The government paid the teachers, but the church decided every word they taught. Nuns did not just pray. They ran the hospitals, the orphanages, and every place society wanted to hide its unwanted. If the church declared you guilty, you were guilty, no trial, no evidence, no appeal. The priest's word was law. In this world, nothing destroyed a woman faster than her reputation. If you became pregnant outside marriage, you were not simply a woman who had made a mistake. You were dirty, you were dangerous, and you had to be locked away where no one could see you. If a man hurt you, nobody blamed him. They blamed you. They said you must have done something to invite it. If you were an orphan with no family to control you, the church saw you as a problem waiting to happen. And if you were simply too pretty, that was dangerous too. Beauty drew attention. Attention meant trouble. Better to lock you away before anything went wrong. That is why Maureen Sullivan was punished for being a victim. In the eyes of the church, there were no innocent victims. If something bad happened to you, you must have deserved it. So Ireland built a system to deal with these women. For religious orders divided the country like a business. The Sisters of Mercy took some areas. The Sisters of Our Lady of Charity took others. The Sisters of Charity and the Good Shepherd Sisters divided the rest. The government did not just look the other way, they were part of it. Courts sent women to the laundries as punishment. Police dragged back anyone who tried to escape. Government agencies sent orphans and difficult girls straight to the nuns. The Irish military sent its uniforms. Hotels and hospitals sent their sheets. Even the president's official residence used these laundries. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone benefited. And the women who did the work never saw a single penny. But here is the question everyone asks. How could nuns do this? How could women who gave their lives to God treat other women so cruelly? The answer is simple and disturbing. Most of these nuns had entered convents as children, some as young as 12 or 13. They had never lived in the real world. They had never learned what normal kindness looked like. They grew up inside a system that taught them certain women were spiritually dirty, almost less than human, and that the only way to cleanse them was through suffering. These nuns did not think they were being cruel. They believed they were saving souls. Every beating brought a woman closer to God. Every punishment cleaned her spirit. Every year of unpaid labor was an act of mercy. They believed they were doing God's work. And that is what made them so dangerous. They were not villains who enjoyed pain. They were true believers who thought cruelty was kindness. And people like that have no limits. Maureen Sullivan's first night inside those walls changed everything she understood about the world. She lay in a room with 30 other women and girls. The beds were so close she could hear every breath. Some women cried quietly into their pillows. Some whispered prayers that would never be answered. Some simply stared at the ceiling with empty eyes, women who had stopped hoping long ago. There were no mirrors, no calendars, no clocks. Maureen realized there was no way to know what day it was or how long she had been there. She turned to the woman in the next bed, an older woman with gray hair and deep lines on her face. Maureen whispered the question that would not leave her mind. "How long have you been here?" The woman held up her hands, all 10 fingers, then did it again and again and again. 40 years. She mouthed one word before turning away. Forever. That was when Maureen understood. There was no release date, no sentence to finish, no end. Women walked into these buildings as teenagers and came out as corpses, if they came out at all. The next morning the routine began. A bell before sunrise. 5 minutes to dress and make your bed. Then mass in the chapel, but the women sat behind wooden screens, hidden from sight because they were not good enough to be seen by decent society. Then the laundry. The room was enormous, filled with machines that hissed steam and groaned like living things. The air was so thick and wet that breathing felt like drowning. The smell of lye soap burned your nose and made your eyes water all day. You scrubbed sheets by hand until they were clean enough for the machines. You fed fabric through giant presses that could crush your fingers in a second. You folded everything into perfect stacks for hotels and hospitals across Ireland. 12 hours, sometimes 14, sometimes more. Your hands cracked and bled from the chemicals. Your back screamed in pain. But you kept working because stopping meant punishment. And through all of it, silence. Total silence. No talking, no whispering, not even humming. The only sounds allowed were prayers and the roar of the machines. You could not speak to the woman beside you. You could not ask her name or share your story. One whisper and you were punished. Trying to make a friend was treated like plotting an escape. This silence was a weapon, and the nuns knew exactly what they were doing. Women who cannot talk cannot organize. They cannot plan escapes. They cannot remind each other that they are human beings who deserve better. The silence kept them broken. Years of this did terrible things to their minds. Some women forgot how to speak, not because their voices failed, but because the words simply stopped coming. Others whispered to themselves when no one was listening, tiny conversations with nobody just to remember the sound of their own voice. And the worst part? The silence did not end when they left. Kathleen eventually escaped. She moved to England, married, had children and grandchildren, and built what looked like a normal life. For 60 years she never told a single person where she had been, not even her husband. They were married 38 years and he never knew. That is how deep the shame went. The nuns had not just locked up their bodies. They had locked up their voices. Maureen Sullivan spent 4 years inside those walls. She entered as a child of 12 and left as a teenager of 16 with nothing but scars on her hands and memories that would haunt her forever. And she was one of the lucky ones. She got out. Marina Gamble was 16 when they brought her to the Good Shepherd Convent in New Ross. Both her parents were dead and she had nowhere else to go. That made her the perfect victim. One afternoon Marina dropped a cup by accident. The nun in charge did not shout. She did not raise her hand. She smiled, walked to a drawer, and took out a thick piece of string. She tied it around Marina's neck. Not tight enough to choke her, but tight enough that she felt it with every breath, every swallow, every moment of every day. For 3 days and 3 nights Marina wore that string. At every meal she had to crawl on her hands and knees to her food on the floor and eat like a dog while the other women watched in silence. After each meal she had to say the same words out loud. I beg Almighty God's pardon, Our Lady's pardon, and my companion's pardon for the bad example I have shown. All because she dropped a cup. But the string was not the worst. One winter night Marina and 2 other girls broke some small rule. The nuns decided to teach them a lesson they would never forget. They locked the 3 girls outside on a glass balcony with no coats, no blankets, no shoes. The temperature was near freezing and falling. The girls held each other for warmth and watched frost form on the glass around them. They stayed out there for 2 full nights. Marina almost died. Her fingers turned blue. Her lips cracked. When the nuns finally opened the door on the 3rd morning, they simply told her to get back to work. Kathleen King had it even worse. The nuns gave her different names throughout her childhood. None of them kind. They called her Satan. They called her Red Boy. They called her Number 5. Why Number 5? Because her mother had been locked in a mother and baby home and known only as S Number 5 for nursing other women's babies. Not a woman, an animal, just a number. And Kathleen inherited her mother's number along with her mother's shame. She remembers nuns beating her head with a heavy ring of keys, metal on skull, over and over. She remembers being left on a cold metal toilet so long that her skin stuck to it and she had to rip herself free. She remembers a visiting priest seeing a fresh bruise on her face and asking what happened. She was too terrified to tell the truth because telling the truth meant more beatings. Some women tried to run. They climbed the walls and fled through the streets, begging strangers for help. The police always caught them. They never asked what was happening inside. They simply dragged the women back to the nuns. Then came the final punishment. They shaved your head completely, taking the last thing that still belonged to you, the last reminder that you had once been a person with a name and a future. If you are still watching, drop a comment. Did you know about the Magdalene Laundries before this video? These women were silenced for decades. Do not let their story stay buried. A lot of women entered the Magdalene Laundries as teenagers. A lot of them never came out. The numbers tell the story the church tried to bury. Researchers have identified the names of around 1,900 women who died inside these places across Ireland. That figure is probably far lower than the true total because many deaths were never recorded. At some laundries, more than half the women in the records died while still locked inside. At the Good Shepherd Laundry in Limerick, 6 out of every 10 women whose names appeared in records between 1961 and 1983 died behind those walls. At High Park in Dublin, the numbers were the same. More than half the women listed between 1954 and 1964 never walked out alive. Researchers compared old census records from 1901 and 1911 with gravestones at Magdalene burial sites. They found women who had been locked inside for between 11 and 74 years. 74 years. That means a woman entered as a teenager and died as an old woman in her 90s. Every single day spent washing other people's sheets. They went in as girls. They came out in coffins. Mary Gaffney never even had a chance. She was born to an unmarried mother she was never allowed to meet. As a baby, she was handed to the nuns. She grew up in their institutions. She worked in the Peacock Lane Laundry in Cork for decades. No pay, no choice, no life outside those walls. When the laundries finally closed, Mary had nowhere to go. She had never known anything else. She stayed on the convent grounds. Her entire life, from the day she was born, was spent in institutions run by nuns. Even years later, her cousin said, Mary would sit in a wheelchair and iron clothes for hours because that was all she had ever been taught to do. When women died inside, no funeral was held. No families were told. The nuns simply buried them in unmarked graves on the convent grounds and moved on to the next girl at the gate. Nobody counted the dead. Nobody cared until 1993. The Sisters of Our Lady of Charity ran a laundry in Drumcondra, Dublin. After more than 100 years, they lost money on the stock market and needed cash. They decided to sell some land to developers. But first they had to move the bodies buried in the convent cemetery. They asked permission to exhume 133 women. That was how many death certificates they could find. When workers started digging, they found 155 bodies, 22 more than anyone had admitted. No names, no records, no death certificates. Of the original 133, only 75 even had proper death certificates. The rest were ghosts. Women who lived, worked, suffered, and died without the government ever knowing they existed. A later investigation revealed that at least 315 women had actually died at that one location. More than double what the nuns had claimed. But what haunts me most is this. When they pulled those bodies from the ground, many still had broken bones and plaster casts. Ankles, wrists, elbows, hands, ribs, bones that had been broken and wrapped but never properly healed. The official record said falls and accidents. Clumsy women who tripped on stairs or slipped on wet floors. Always accidents. Always the women's fault. The survivors knew the truth. The nuns burned all 155 bodies, mixed the ashes together, and dumped them in a single hole at Glasnevin Cemetery. 155 women turned to ashes and buried in one grave. They called it an administrative error. That mass grave changed everything. Survivors who had stayed silent for decades finally found the courage to speak. Documentaries showed the truth to the world. The Irish public demanded answers. In 2013, the Irish government issued a formal apology. Prime Minister Enda Kenny stood in Parliament and said the words these women had waited their whole lives to hear. He admitted that the women of the Magdalene Laundries had been let down by the Irish state. Maureen Sullivan, now a grown woman who had fought for this moment for years, watched the apology on television. She had been that 12-year-old girl they hid in the tunnel. She had become the woman who refused to let the world forget. At last, she said, we've been heard, but this will never take away our hurt. The government set up a fund for survivors. By 2022, more than 800 women had received payments, around 33 million euros in total. But the religious orders, the same nuns who ran the laundries, who beat the women, who buried them in unmarked graves, refused to pay a single euro. Not 1 cent, not one building, not one piece of the land they had profited from for decades. The Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, the Sisters of Charity, and the Good Shepherd Sisters together owned property worth hundreds of millions of euros, schools, hospitals, nursing homes across Ireland. They gave nothing. They issued statements saying it was regrettable that the Magdalene homes had existed at all. They claimed the laundries were simply part of the system and culture of the time. They acted as if they had no choice, as if it had simply happened to them too. The same hands that tied strings around girls' necks. The same voices that called children Satan. The same people who kept every penny from decades of free labor. They offered only regret. Just regret. The last Magdalene Laundry in Ireland closed on October 25, 1996. Think about that date for a moment. 1996. The internet was already going mainstream. Titanic was being filmed. The world was preparing for a new millennium. And in Dublin, women were still scrubbing sheets in total silence, still watched by nuns who believed hurting people was the same as helping them, still begging God to forgive them for sins they had never committed. 30,000 women passed through these places over nearly 200 years. Some stayed for months, some for decades, some never left. By the 1950s, 1 out of every 100 people in Ireland was locked inside some kind of religious institution. Maureen Sullivan was one of them. She went in at 12 and came out at 16, changed forever. She could have stayed silent like so many others. Instead, she spent the rest of her life fighting for the women who could not fight for themselves. She found other survivors and collected their stories. She pushed for investigations. She demanded that the government admit what had happened. She made sure that the unmarked graves finally received headstones. I don't believe in unmarked graves for survivors, she said. We were treated like nobodies. I will not let us be buried like nobodies. The buildings still stand all over Ireland today. Some are crumbling with broken windows and collapsing walls. Others have been turned into apartments where young people live with no idea what happened beneath their floors. For the women who survived, and for the thousands who did not, no memorial will ever be enough. No apology can return the decades that were stolen. No amount of money can heal wounds this deep. They asked for nothing except to be treated like human beings. Ireland said no. This is crown and dagger. We do not hide from history. We show you what actually happened. If this story mattered to you, subscribe. More videos like this are coming.